strategies. We're excited to take a deep dive into some of the unique data that Agile collects, but before we start the program, I'm going to review just a few quick housekeeping items. We will be leaving time at the end of the presentation for questions. You can go ahead and send in your questions as they come up for you, and I'll put them into the queue to be answered at the end of the webinar. To send a question, simply click on the Questions tab on your control panel, type your question into the top box, and then click on the Send button. And as I said, I'll put it into the queue to be answered at the end of the webinar. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use that questions feature to get my attention, and I'll do my best to resolve the problem for you. We will be providing you with a recording of the webinar and a copy of the slide deck, so keep an eye on your inbox for a link to those materials tomorrow. You'll also notice in your control panel that you've got access to a handout. That handout is actually some more information about one of the data sets that we're going to talk about today. So you've got that there in your control panel, and it will also be available in the follow-up email that we send. Now let's get started. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Mike LeClare. Mike is responsible for maintaining Agile Education Marketing's record of exceptional data quality. In his role as Data Compilation and Quality Manager, he oversees all specialized data initiatives executed by the Agile team. Prior to joining Agile in 2012, Mike held a number of operationally focused and data-driven roles within the information technology and services industries. As an experienced leader, Mike now manages Agile's team of data experts whose focus is compiling complex educator information and conducting quality control processes to ensure high data accuracy and reliability. In addition, Mike leads special compilation efforts, often working closely with various state departments and districts to compile specialized information sets that are unique to Agile. In addition to being an expert data analyst, Mike is an avid traveler, passionate football fan. He did note that we have scheduled this webinar in the midst of a break on the World Cup, so he's real happy about that. Video game fanatic and an exceptional husband and father. We're really pleased to have Mike with us today to share some of how to put Agile's most interesting data variables to work to improve targeting and segmentation and ultimately generate greater response from the educators you're trying to connect with. So with all that said, I'm going to go ahead and hand the program over to Mike now.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I want to thank you guys for logging in for the webinar. Like we were discussing, we're going to talk today about making sure you can properly engage and reach out to clients or prospective clients. And we're going to dig in on some of the data we have here at Agile, in particular focusing on shallow knowledge versus deep knowledge, and then focusing on ESSA, or Every Student Succeeds. We're going to be digging in on that, showing you how you can make that work. The presentation will take probably 30-35 minutes, and like we said, we'll have time to answer any questions you might have at the end. We're going to jump in and go from there. So we want to make sure when you're reaching out to prospective clients, you need to make sure you have current data. You have to be able to show your clients or prospective clients that you know what they're dealing with. You need to show that you can relate to them. You need to be able to display how you can solve problems. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to show you how that deeper knowledge really digs in and makes your message relatable and actionable for your clients. How are decisions made? It comes down to needs and relevance. With that in mind, Scott and Verlin, two of my associates, really dug in on this subject earlier in an earlier webinar. You can download that on our site as well, but when you're engaging with a client, everybody knows, does it align with their need? Does it address a specific need I have? In this example, if we're talking to a struggling school and you're trying to pitch a 3D printer, that's not going to be the best product you're going to be trying to pitch to them. You need to show how you can solve a specific issue, how you can tackle what they're dealing with. And like I said, that's what this webinar today is going to dig in and show you how our data can make sure you're crafting the right message. We're going to be going over a lot of different terms, a lot of different acronyms today, and it's best to make sure we all start off on the same page. So I'm going to give a really brief, quick overview on federal allocation of funds to schools. So we're going to go back to 65, back when Johnson passed the ESSA Act. That's the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It was passed by Johnson back in 65, and to really keep it simple, it just dealt with federal allocation of funds to schools. Then years later, we decided that it'd be best if we had some kind of accountability to hold those schools to. And when W was president, he created the NCLB, AYP, No Child Left Behind. It really was just an update to the ESEA. But what it did is it made data applicable to all states. They had to have metrics associated with English, with math, with graduation rate, participation. It was nice because it gave federal metrics across the board to all the states. Where it wasn't so nice is it was an all or nothing approach. You either passed or you failed. It also didn't take into consideration aspects. For example, if a school is at 50% graduation rate, it's completely unrealistic to expect that school to jump up to the 95% goal that was set. It didn't take into consideration growth or anything like that. So as this program evolved, they started allowing what was called ESEA waivers. And what that did is that allowed states to create their own metrics associated with accountability. And they were really fun documentations. They were about 300 pages long, and they justified to the feds how they were going to do what AYP tried to do, but how they were going to do it at a state level. And then it got approved, or it got denied, and they'd have to submit another one. What it did, though, is it gave the power to the states. It said, we're going to still hold our districts and schools accountable, but we're going to get to set up our own metrics. It was great because it really gave the power to the states. What it also did, though, is it made sure that all the data wasn't the same as it was before, i.e. it wasn't one nice, clean data set where everything was comparable. Now states had the freedom to really dig in and do whatever they wanted as long as they could justify it. When ESSA came around, or ESSA, it was really just a continuation of this evolution. Instead of saying you can submit a waiver so you don't have to follow AYP, ESSA said, no, you're going to have to submit something and you're going to set up your own metrics. And they ended up adjusting a couple of little things. They put a little emphasis on preschool programs. They, of course, continued the state-specific metrics for overall school accountability and proficiencies and such. It required ELA and math testing in grades 3 through 8, once in high school. It now required science, although not as frequent as language and math. And then it also gave a couple more demographics. The nice thing, regardless of the administration, is they're still giving power to the states. Although this is continually evolving, the one thing that's been fairly consistent for the better part of a decade is they're giving responsibility to the states. So that's a real brief history of a pretty complicated subject, but now that we're all on the same page, we're going to jump into kind of the collection process on how do we make sure we can make the data that's different for every state relatable, how we can normalize it, and how we can make it actionable for you guys. So real briefly, we're going to talk about the collection, like I said, how we normalize it, and how we make it actionable. For the data collection, with AYP, it all came from one data source. It was clean, it was nice, and it was really easy for anybody to pull up and look. Now that's not the case. With the new setup, states can, as long as they follow a couple guidelines, they can have multiple tests, they can have multiple ways to make sure that their school is accountable. And what this does is it creates a lot of work. For example, multiple files. It's not uncommon for a state to have 10, 15 different files, some as many as 20, to make sure they're showing all their information. You could have a separate file for grade 3 level math, then another file for grade 4 level math and 5, and then a separate one for language, and then another one for graduation rate. Also, there's no real checklist saying, hey, do you make sure, did we get everything from the state? One of the nice things that we've been doing here at Agile, this is our 3rd year of collecting this sort of data, so we've developed relationships. We don't have a checklist, but we have our checklist, and we make sure that we're collecting social studies where available. We're collecting all those proficiencies. And then we're also collecting overall school accountability, where if you're not worried about a specific subject, but you want to see how the school is doing as a whole, is that data available as well? And we've developed some good relationships at the state level that allow us to make sure that our coverage is very, very solid. So with all the different data sources, how do you normalize it? Before with AYP, it was a one-size-fits-all. You passed it or you didn't. Just to show you guys some different examples, Massachusetts, Washington, Florida, they all have different ways to show how their school is doing. Massachusetts uses the accountability and assistant levels 1 through 5. Washington has a color scale. Florida likes using A through F. And each one is completely justifiable with the new ESSA setup or ESSA. What we do is we normalize that data. So for the overall school accountability, if you know the state, we keep that data. If you don't know the state and you just want to see it at a national level, we normalize that as well. And as we get a little further into the presentation, we'll dig in and actually show you examples of how we normalize that. This is just to kind of show you that states get a lot of freedom and they each get to do it their own way. So this is where we start getting into the actionable items of the story. What we wanted to do is we wanted to show you the why. Why is this data important? What can I do with it? So what we did is we took 2 schools that are really close to Agile, both Denver public schools, and we said, okay, let's take a look at them and see what kind of shallow knowledge you get if you just pull one central file for organizations and such, and what happens when you really dig in and see what each school is trying to tell you with their test scores and such. So what we did is we took Greenlee Elementary and we took Steck Elementary. They're about 4 miles apart. They're both built around the same time. And you'll see they share a lot of other similarities. Like I said, they're both in Denver public schools. They both have ESL programs. They have high-speed internet. They have similar student enrollments. They have similar number of teachers, and they're both pre-K through 5. On the surface, it looks like these schools are quite comparable. But again, once we start looking at the ESSA data or the ESSA data, you're going to see how they both paint very different stories. And if you're sending them the same message, it doesn't work. Moving along, when you start digging a little deeper, you can see Title I is quite a bit, there's a large variance in Title I as well for the schools. You can see Greenlee, almost 83% of their students fall under Title I. They have about 314 free lunch students, as opposed to Steck, well, their numbers are considerably lower. They're at about 12% for Title I students, and about 38 of their students have free lunch. And again, this is getting a little deeper, but we're not really digging into the ESSA data yet. If you look at the student population, this also paints another picture for you. You can see there's quite a bit of difference between the 2 schools. With different backgrounds, it creates different perspectives, needs, and challenges. And if you don't start digging in, you're not going to be able to make sure you craft the right message for your client or prospective client. So we've looked at the shallow knowledge, the data that's available with a simple pull, making sure you can look at it, get what you need to, and you're going to think the schools are the somewhat similar, little difference in ethnicity, a little difference in title, or big difference in Title I, but the numbers and everything else look pretty much the same. Now we're going to jump in to the ESSA data. So at Agile, we dig in, and like I said, we go to every single state website and we collect this data for all 50 states and DC. In Colorado, our academic scale is a school performance framework. We always start with the highest and go down to the lowest, so if you're not familiar with the state, it's perfectly fine. In Colorado, it starts with performance, and then it goes to improvement, and then priority improvement, and turnaround. And each metric has different aspects that need to be approached. Last year, Greenlee was in priority improvement. And Mr. Reynolds, the principal, actually had to go in front of the Colorado Department of Education and justify why his school shouldn't be put on a list that could potentially close the next year. He had to come in front of them with a plan, show them why it was going to work, and show them how quickly they could get things going. For the current year, you can see that Greenlee did good. They moved up a level to improvement. STEC has been consistent for the last 2 years. They've been at performance. They've been at the highest academic indicator. And again, we actually collect other metrics associated with this. Some states will have raw points that show you how they fall into an academic indicator and how they rate within their academic scale. So it's kind of a secondary indicator. We also collect graduation rates for high schools and such, and those are metrics that really apply to the entire school and give you a better idea of how the school is doing. But for this, it's best to focus on the 3 that we're pointing out in this presentation. It's the academic scale, so you know where we're coming from, and it's the academic indicator. Well, as we talked about earlier, we want to make sure we normalize that data. So if you're not familiar with Colorado and you just want to know where schools fall at a federal level, we adjust the points. And we created a metric scale 100 to 1 or to 0. And what that does is it helps normalize the data across the board. So if you want failing schools, more or less, if you go right around 40 points, that's where most states will say this school is at an unacceptable level of performance. You can see the Greenlee, they shot up to 66. Last year, they would have been at 33 because they are second from the bottom. STEC has remained consistent at 100 points. Now, the nice thing about doing it this way is we don't take any kind of reviews into account. What that means is we can't have an upset parent write a really negative review and bring down a score. We can't have a really happy parent write a positive review and bring up a score. We take that out. What we do is we report the numbers that are reported to the feds. So that money, that Title IV that just got a huge bump of nearly $700 million, so that can be allocated. This is how Colorado reports it to the feds. And what that does is it takes up any kind of feel-good metrics. Like I said, there's nothing in there that says, oh, Johnny had a rough day, the teachers are mean. Nope, these are the numbers that are reported, and that's how we report across the board. Digging in deeper, what's available is, like I said, with the ESSA data, it was required that grades 3 through 8 report English, math, and ones for science, and then you have to test those again in high school. For these 2 schools, we reported 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. We focus on the LA scores, language arts. You can see there's a huge variance here. Nearly 50%. They're not dealing with the same issues. In grade 3, they don't even have 16% of the kids that Colorado has deemed using our tests proficient in English. At grade 4, it's just above 20. As opposed to STEC, they're almost 70% for grade level 3. They're almost at 76%. And what this performance aid does is it really digs in, and this one shows you what the students are dealing with their specific subjects. Also, if you notice, grade 5 was not present for language arts for Greenlee. And you'll see this with the accountability data every once in a while. What happens is student confidentiality comes into play. And the really, really simple breakdown of that is if you can point out it might be a specific student or small group of students, states will suppress the data. And you see that happen. Not so much in the more metropolitan areas, but it does happen. So for Colorado, they didn't present grade 5 data for Greenlee, excuse me. But you can see that STEC is doing very, very well at grade 5. They're almost at 90% proficiency. And what that does is that paints 2 completely different pictures. Cumulatively, Greenlee was at about 18% for proficient students. 18% of their students were proficient in language, as opposed to STEC's 76. And again, like we touched on earlier, if you're trying to reach them with the same message, you're gonna miss the mark. To really drive the point home, what we did is we actually reached out to both principals at Greenlee and STEC to say, we think we know what you deal with because of the data. Does it actually show what you're dealing with? I think you'll see with the response from the Greenlee principal, Mr. Reynolds, that data paints exactly what he's dealing with. We asked the same questions for each principal. We asked what was your goal at the principal level, what's your greatest obstacle, what's your biggest factor. And here at Agile, we know Greenlee pretty well. We actually volunteer and do a reading program during the year once a week where a group of us go over, and Mr. Sheldon is very committed to trying to make sure those scores get up. So he was very approachable, very easy to touch base with, and he gave us our answers, and the data paints exactly what he's dealing with. His biggest obstacle to make sure his building stayed open when he went through is he was concerned he didn't have enough time. And the perception of what was
Mike, I'm just going to interject because you are kind of blipping out occasionally. So if you could maybe just back up slightly and start over, not start over, but give a little bit more background on Mr. Sheldon, because you did blip out for a few seconds, just a little bit ago.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay. So what we did is we reached out to each principal. And Principal Reynolds is a principal at Greenlee. And like I was saying, we actually do a reading program at Greenlee, so it's really easy to touch base with Mr. Reynolds. A group of the staff here at Agile, we go over and we read every Wednesday to him during the school year. And as I was saying, Mr. Reynolds is very committed to trying to make sure he gets his scores up. So when we reached out to him with these three questions, what's your goal, what's your largest obstacle, what causes you the most amount of stress, the data paints the picture. His goal, just like every principal's goal, is to make sure that they provide a good education to their students. They'll word it differently, but to make the vision, mission statement of the school a reality. And you can see it down below. Every Greenlee student will develop a lifelong agency by becoming adaptable, well-balanced individual. Well, when we dug in a little bit more, we asked him what his biggest obstacle was. The data paints this perfectly. Time. Perception of what was once a historically low-performing school and outside factors of the school. General rational poverty, trauma, high mobility. He's had, as we mentioned earlier, he had to deal with going in front of the Colorado Department of Education and make sure his school didn't get shut down. And he had a year to get his scores up. And he did. And that took a huge amount of commitment from everybody at the school to make sure that happened. Look at the biggest stress factor, not having time to waste, coupled with the fact that we often don't give enough time to make appropriate changes as needed. Case in point, if you have a product that helps out with language scores, let's say you've been able to show that ELA scores jump 10% in 6 months. If you craft that message to this school, they're going to be intrigued. They're going to say, hey, this is actually relevant to the issues I'm facing. I don't have much time. And this is across the board. It's not just Colorado. If you're a failing school, all the states are spending time and energy and money to try to get that school back up. But what it does is if you craft a message, like I was saying, and say, hey, we can jump you up 15% in 3 weeks, that's going to attract the attention of this school, this principal. He doesn't have time. He needs to get that score up. And that's the way you're going to want to craft that message, as opposed to the principal over at STEC, Ms. Robin Klein. When we reached out, the goal was pretty similar once again. To provide leadership and guidance to adults, children in a safe, stimulating, healthy environment. In an entertaining fashion, if you will, the obstacle, she was actually having a hard time with the accountability measures that's gone across at the federal level. Colorado, for obviously this example. Public education has so many accountability measures that it's taken the joy and art out of teaching learning. Funding is also a huge obstacle in Colorado for non-Title I schools. Top-down mandates a one-size-fits-all. So even though she's doing pretty well, she's still having obstacles in making sure she stays up there. The biggest factor, where Mr. Reynolds was concerned that all his associates in his school would be closed down, Principal Klein was concerned about helicopter parents. She was concerned about managing difficult parents whose expectations are beyond what we can legally provide in a public setting. And again, the data helps paint all this. If you're dealing with a school that's very high performing, going back to the example of offering a language arts product, and you reach out to the first school and say, we can increase your scores very quickly, well, if you just curb this and say, you know what, our product, what it allows parents to do is they're able to check and see the status of their kids. They can see how much they've read and see how many points they've accumulated or how far they've progressed, and it takes that aspect away. There's a lot of different things that go into student success. One of the things that has been shown to prove quite successful is parent involvement. And with the higher schools, this is going to be the case. And again, if you're crafting the same message for both of these people, you're going to miss the mark. And this data, this ESSA data that we provide, it's current, it lets you dig in, it paints a picture that's relatable and actionable for your clients or prospective clients. So kind of to summarize, come back to everything, you need to make sure that you're selecting your target strategically. We have the data's out there. It's difficult to collect, but it's certainly accessible and relatable with the way we've normalized it across the states that you can craft the right message for your clients. The data is actionable, and you can show how your product aligns with their need. The school performance data allows access to deeper knowledge. The shallow knowledge, where it looks like the schools are the same, it just doesn't cut it anymore. The school performance data really lets you dive in and show how you can present a solution to what they're facing. So we had a chance to go through a lot of different information, and I think now might be a really good time to answer some questions that maybe I didn't dig in deep enough on, or maybe I didn't touch, or other aspects I need to review again. But hopefully you guys got some good stuff out of this and some good questions. So.
Yeah, I think this was fantastic, Mike. Thanks so much. It really was fascinating to see the difference between those two schools that are right here in the same town and not that far from each other. So that was a really helpful illustration. And we do have some questions that have come in, and certainly we can take some more, so folks feel free to send in additional ones. So the first question that we have is, how can I take all the different states' data and find similar schools? So basically come up with a nice targeted audience.
Well, that's a really good question, and it can be difficult, like we talked about, saying, you know, Massachusetts uses this academic indicator, and Florida uses this academic indicator. And what we do is, if you know the state, you can jump in and say, hey, I saw you had this. If you wanted to attack it at the federal level, what we did is we weight that scale of 100 to 1, or excuse me, 0 again. What that does is the very top score is given 100, the very bottom score is given a score of 0, and that normalizes the data across all the states. What it also does is it takes away any upset or very proud parents. It reports the scores that are reported to the feds. And what we found through looking at multiple states is right around 40 points is where a school would be considered failing or at an unacceptable level of performance. So going back again, how do you apply it across the board? You look at the point scale. And the top schools are right going to be around 100, 80, bottom schools will be at 0 or right above that, and 40 is really that break even, failing or passing.
Okay, we did just have a follow-up question to that come in. Does Agile provide the assessment results by subject area or just as an overall general score?
Okay, what we do is we report the proficiency levels. So for English, math, science, and then where available, social studies and writing, we present the percentage of students that are proficient or above. And we do that for every grade that the state reports on. With ESSA, it's required they report on grades 3 through 8. Where available, we also report at the cumulative level. So you can see how the school's doing in a specific subject, or you can see how a specific grade is doing. And like I said, we dig in at the English, math, and science for the majority of the schools. This year, because they've had a couple years to get everything in line, we had 100% coverage at grade level proficiency data. I believe it was 49 out of the 51 states, including DC, we are able to get cumulative data as well for specific subject levels.
Well, that's fantastic, because that was actually another question that was asked. So thanks for clarifying that.
Well, and it's important to know that paints half the story. It's really good to have an understanding of where they're proficient and where they're not. But when we're looking at that overall school accountability, that academic indicator, that's part of the story. You know, depending on the state, they'll have graduation rates and growth rates and everything going in. And it's great to know how they're doing in a specific subject, that student level, but it's also important to see how are they doing overall. And that's where that school accountability, the academic indicator and scale really come into play to paint the full picture.
Okay, and actually, you mentioned the indicators, and we've had someone ask if you're specifically collecting the 5th indicator, which is the non-academic indicator under ESSA, if you're able to collect that, and if so, is that something that's available to target by?
But by non-academic, I want to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. It could be talking about the priority schools where they collect the bottom 5–10% and then the top 10%. If that's the case, that's not actually as readily available as they've presented. We do collect it. We have a secondary indicator. We actually have 8 different metrics for the school accountability. It's the raw points, the point scale, graduation rate, graduation met, and academic status. And that's kind of a secondary indicator where, you know, if a school is reporting priority or turnaround or reward, that's where that data would go. The reason that's not used as a primary academic indicator is that only focuses on the extremes. We want to make sure we're hitting all the schools. And by collecting it at the state level, using the state-specific metric, we're able to report on all the schools as opposed to a small group of schools.
That makes sense, yeah. Let's see. So moving on a little bit, but are you able to select schools, or as a marketer, am I able to select schools whose performance has improved or declined over time? Can I select schools that have new data showing that their performance has recently declined?
That's actually a really good question. We do, like I've talked about, we do keep historical data. Where it can get a little tricky is, like we talked about, states were given the freedom to use different tests. And if the tests have stayed consistent, then you're comparing apples to apples, and we can go back and we can say, you know, they've shown gradual growth or they've decreased over, and you can start seeing patterns. Where it gets a little tricky is during the ESSA waivers and ESSA, states were trying different things. They're using different tests. So unfortunately, you'll see some states that generally with a new test, because it's a new curriculum, they'll generally spike down a little bit. So it makes it difficult to compare apples to apples in those cases. In the same breath, you could use the academic indicators and the overall school, you know, the point scale. That might give you a little better indication of how the school's doing. without having to research what test did they use this year, did they use the same test this year. And we actually have that data on our side on what tests they use. We keep track of it just so we can make sure if we're reaching out to the state, we're using the correct terminology. It's not in a real presentable format, but if somebody really wanted to dig in, we could look at providing some sort of information to say, you know, if you're curious about this state, they've used the same test the last 2 years and such, and make sure you're really comparing the same test, same scores.
That makes sense. Back to your whole normalizing everything. We want to be comparing apples to apples.
Exactly.
So is any performance data available on private schools, or is this just for public schools?
There was 2 states, and it was Wisconsin, and honestly I can't remember the other state right now, and I apologize. If that person really wants to know, I can dig in through our notes and find out which other state reported metrics at the private school level. More or less, and I'm making a generalization here, private schools don't get the same sort of funding that the public schools get, so they don't have to adhere to the same setup. Along those lines, charter schools are public schools, so they have to follow the exact same stuff. So charter schools would definitely be included in this. The private representation, it's Wisconsin, and like I said, I think it's one other state, but I just can't remember that right now. If that person wants to shoot me an email, I'd be happy to dig in and try to find that other one. But overall, private schools were not represented.
Okay, that is definitely helpful. What's the difference between ESSA data and NAEP data, which for those who may not know that acronym is National Assessment of Educational Progress? And, you know, basically, why can't we just use that NAEP data?
Well, the NAEP data is really nice from the standpoint, it all comes from one source. You can look at it and it applies to a group of districts, and it's all from one data source. But you're not looking at the right data if you're using NAEP data. They only test every 2 years for math and reading. For science, it's less than that. They only test at grades 4 through 8, and at the district, they only summarize at the district level. So you can't dig in and see the schools that are really struggling. I mean, NAEP themselves say they're not designed to report results for individual students or schools. They grab groups of students and then they try to make sure that it's an accurate representation of the district as a whole. And it's not the data that they're reporting back to the feds for that Title I, Title IV funds. So although NAEP does provide some information, that's not the data that the states are using. It's not the data the feds are referencing. It's just, there's better data out there and it's accessible and we have it.
Yeah, it seems like the NAEP is kind of a pulse check, whereas when you're really talking about sales and marketing targeting, you need that school by school, as you illustrated with the 2 schools here in Denver, same district, 2 really different needs going on for those principals. Absolutely.
You got to make sure that message is relatable.
Exactly. So you referenced the timing on NAEP. What's the frequency and timing for the performance data that Agile's collecting?
So for the ESSA data, that's released once a year. But again, going back to the collection process, it's not clean. All the states don't get together and say, all right, at the beginning of the school year, we're going to release all our data. It's generally released in pieces. Maybe they'll release language and math together, but they're going to wait on their school scores until they're able to have people point out why their scores should be higher in certain subjects and stuff like that. So what we do here at Agile is we generally start towards the beginning of the new calendar year. It gives the states a couple months to get things going, and by then, generally in February, we're able to start collecting closer to full data sets. And as we talked about earlier, if we can't find data, because there's no nice little checklist for every state, we reach out to the state and say, hey, I found your language, I found your math, I didn't see the science scores, and then we get a response. We either find a website that says we're not releasing that data this year, or they'll say, yeah, we're using a new test, we don't have this, and we keep track of that. Along those lines, SAT and ACT scores are generally released considerably later. So what we do is in the summer, we go back and we review what wasn't there and what they said, hey, we're going to release that probably at the end of the school year. So it's kind of well, multiple steps, but kind of two different windows that we really collect the data. We'll hit it in January, February, and this is a process. We do everything here at Agile. It's myself and an associate. We dig in. All that data is collected, reported, normalized by the two of us. So when there's questions, we're able to answer the questions quickly, but it takes a while. It takes 2 to 3 months of dedicated work to get that all. So, like I said, kind of circle back and answer in a more concise manner. We check at the beginning of the year, and then we check again in the summer to collect the data that wasn't available.
Oh, and I think that detail on exactly what you're doing in those different sources is really helpful in understanding that process and assuring the accuracy and the quality of it. And this actually segues into another question. Someone's asked, do you routinely reach out directly to district and school administrators, as you did in this example, to verify the data and identify their needs?
For this one, we just wanted to make sure that the data painted the right picture. So we just reached out to these two to get their responses. We don't generally reach out to multiple principals or district level employees. It was just to make sure that the story does, or the data does indeed tell the right story, and in this case, it did. So.
Yeah, which I think is a good pulse check on that the data really does tell the story that we need to know when we're developing our marketing plans and thinking about having conversations with these school leaders about our products and programs. So it looks like we're about to get to our final question, though we do have time for more. So if anyone in the audience has another one that they want to send in, we're happy to take it. But I'll go ahead and ask the last one I have in the queue. Have you collected states' ESSA plans, and are you able to identify priorities across states?
We have not. I chuckle because the ESSA plans are generally several hundred pages long, so we don't collect those. But we had to, at the start of this process a couple of years ago, we had to dig in to make sure we were able to, again, use the correct terminology when trying to search state Department of Education websites and such. So we don't collect them at that level. What we do pay attention to is what tests are states using to provide the proficiency data and such. As far as what their priorities are, the way ESSA is set up is that school accountability, the academic indicator and scale. Obviously the is where they spend a lot of their energy. If you're a school like STEC that's generally doing pretty good, you don't get as much of attention. And some states are rewarding schools that are doing much better with giving them more freedom. But again, a lot of the energy and a lot of the funds goes to those struggling schools, and that's the case across the board. Yeah,
that makes sense. Those documents are deep and not at all standardized. So yes, that's difficult data to get at. But as you said, definitely were referenced as you started to put together the framework for the data that is available from Agile. So it looks like we have come to the end of the questions, but those were some great questions, folks. So thanks for asking them. And thanks again to Mike for joining us to share this information and this really informative profile of these two schools and what that means when we're looking at targeting and segmentation for our sales and marketing lists. As a reminder, we will send you an email later today or tomorrow that includes a link to view the recording of today's webinar and to download the slides. There'll also be more information about the ESSA and school performance data. As I said, that handout's available now in your control panel, but we'll also be providing a link to it in the email and the landing page that email directs you to. So keep an eye out for that in your inbox. Also, when you log off from the webinar, you'll be prompted to answer a few quick survey questions. If you could just take a few seconds, that's really all it takes, to provide your feedback on today's program, that would be very appreciated. We're also open to suggestions for topics for future webinars, and that will help us with our planning to make sure that we're providing you with the information that you want and need. And speaking of future webinars, go ahead and mark your calendar for our next one that's coming up on July 24th. That's a Tuesday. Agile's email and direct marketing experts Suzanne Morgan and Dave Cohen will be presenting email strategies to drive your business from start to inbox to dollars. As we get closer to back to school, getting the latest information on email best practices and also an update on what GDRP means to you is going to be really valuable. So I hope you can join us for that webinar as well. Keep an eye on your email inbox as well as the Agile website for registration details for that event. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you again, Mike, for sharing all this information. I hope everybody has a great afternoon.